I'm going to hit you with a bucket of vocabulary right now, some terminology that's very important that you can wrap your head around and be able to use fluently in this course. And the new term you're going to get right now is maximum sustainable yield, because you need to be able to talk about how this term, the maximum sustainable yield, is related to productivity in a system, the net productivity in a system. But before I touch on that, I want to kind of bring you back and re-jog your memory about natural capital and natural income, because all of these terms are related to each other. So let's take a look. Natural capital, is do you remember this slide back from when we were doing topic 1.4? Natural capital are the natural resources that we have to use, right? And that is so it's the forest or the fish in the pond and that produces natural income, okay? And remember, the goods and services, if they're used sustainably, that's the natural income. So if, the trees that we're harvesting from the forest, if we're using them sustainably at a rate that they can grow back, then that timber that we're taking from the forest is natural income. And the forest itself is the natural capital to start with. So I think you guys are comfortable with that term, natural income and natural capital. And of course, always tying the idea of sustainability there, because if we're not using our natural capital sustainably, then it's not actually providing natural income because it can't be replenished. And of course, natural capital provides natural income in the term of goods and services. Okay, so now let's look back at this idea of maximum sustainable yield. It's equivalent to the net primary or net secondary productivity of a system. So what that means, first of all, here's the basics of sustainable yield. It's the natural income that can be exploited without depleting that original stock. Sustainable yield is how much you can take, is the amount of that goods and services that you can take from the system when it can still be replenished. So it is essentially pretty much synonymous with natural income. So it's how much yield is how much something's producing that you can take out of a system. So if it's trees in the forest or if it's fish from the pond. So it's how much you can actually exploit, you can take without depleting the original stock. So you can often use the idea of sustainable yield and natural income sustainably. The maximum is the absolute maximum amount that you can harvest from a population. So if we have a certain number of deer in the forest, the maximum amount of natural income that you can take, or the maximum sustainable yield, would be the number of deer that you could harvest in a year to still have that full population recover for the following harvest. So here's an example, right? So we tend to use sustainable yield when we're talking about populations of things, when we're trying to harvest stuff. So if we have a fish population of 100 fish, right? And that fish consumes enough energy so their population grows to 120 fish. So that the net secondary productivity, so the amount of new fish, all of that extra biomass and energy that has been gained, is essentially 20 fish, right? And so the net secondary productivity of that population is 20 fish, right? Because that's how much biomass that they've added to that whole population, how much energy in that time period. So it's essentially the same thing, though, is the maximum sustainable yield. So if you take 20 fish out, if they would be able to come back to, the normal amount of 120 fish for the next population, then you're harvesting it at that appropriate maximum sustainable yield. Okay, so these terms tend to be pretty synonymous with each other, but they tend to be used in slightly different contexts. So here's the three terms that are all related to each other that you should be comfortable with. So net productivity is that gain in energy or biomass per unit area per unit time after respiratory losses. And so you can actually apply that to populations to an extent, right? Like the number of individuals is that it can be part of that biomass, but we tend to weigh it up as biomass or energy when we're talking about productivity. Natural income is more of a general term, right? When we're looking at the goods and services that are provided from that natural capital. And then the maximum sustainable yield is, we tend to apply that to populations that we're harvesting. So it's the maximum sustainable yield is how much you can take from that system, Okay, so in that example, it was the 20 fish that we could take out. Um, that was the net productivity, same as the natural income, same as the maximum sustainable yield, right? Um, if you're not planning on harvesting it, we tend to not use the term maximum sustainable yield just for net productivity or natural income. So it tends to be more situational in when that's used, because we're really talking about pulling trees out of the forest, pulling fish out of the pond.